morning, everybody.
Hello.
Hello. Great to have you today. I decided to pick a song that was Thanksgiving themed since we're not going to be the next Wednesday. So it was perfectly, if you were here Saturday night, I heard Dennis sing a song that's about count your blessings. So we're going to do that hymn today. So y'all sing out and think about all the many, many, many blessings that God has given you and that we just had every day. So let's sing. When upon life's billows you are tempest-tossed, when you are discouraged thinking all is lost, count your many blessings, make them one by one, and it will surprise you what the Lord has done. Count your blessings, make them one by one. Count your blessings, see what God has done. Count your blessings, make them one by one. Yes. Count your many blessings, see what God has done. Are you ever burdened with the load of care? Does the cross seem heavy you are called to bear? Count your many blessings, every doubt will fly, and you will be singing as the days go by. Count your blessings, make them one by one. Count your blessings, see what God has done. Count your blessings, watch me, name them one by one. Count your many blessings, see what God has done. So amid the conflict, whether great or small, do not be discouraged, God is over all. Count your many blessings, angels will attend, help and comfort give you to your journey's end. Count your blessings, name them one by one. Count your blessings, see what God has done. Count your blessings, name them one by one. Count your many blessings, see what God has done. Good job. What we're going to do now is actually count every single blessing we've ever had. Just joking.
We don't have enough time for
I
that.
know. Amy Morowski's here. All right, All right. The contest for today.
We have to think.
The number one. This is a two-part. Raise your hand if you know the answers. The first part is what is the main tradition on Thanksgiving Day? What is on the list of all the things that happen on Thanksgiving Day? What do they host as the number one tradition?
Passing the peace pipe.
Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade.
Yes. Watching the
I
Macy's
only know this because I
Thanksgiving
watch it every year.
Day Parade. Okay. Has anybody ever been? That's on my bucket list. I want to do that one.
Yeah, I would like to do that too, but I've heard that it's horribly crowded.
That's what I like about it. Okay, so the question for the prize this morning is, don't look it up, don't Google it. What year did it start?
I knew that was coming.
What year did it
Before my time, I'm sure.
I
This is on my list now.
don't know. I've been on your list for a long time. Anybody want to take a guess?
What was the question?
What year did the parade first start? The Macy's Thanksgiving Parade. Yes, ma'am.
I'm guessing 1969.
Oh, no.
1934.
Amy?
Oh, before that?
No, but
Oh,
close.
really?
Lauren?
25.
Nope.
I would say 1930.
You get one guess.
1936.
You get one guess.
32.
32? No, G?
1936.
No.
34.
No. Kathy?
1980.
18?
That's when my mother was born.
Angel?
1928.
No.
Are we close?
Amy was close, and Yolanda was close.
Come on, Bill, you should know.
24.
24.
After all these guesses.
Lauren, did you get one of these already?
1920.
Okay, then I got something else for you. Okay, 1924 was the first Thanksgiving Day parade.
Almost 100 years.
Yeah.
That was way before my time, by the way.
Oh, was it?
My dad's birthday.
All right. Before I dismiss you to Donna, our weekly comedian, I will be sending out an email or some type of information giving you all the things that are happening in December for this group, for the seniors group. So be able to look at it because we don't have Bible study next week. So, Donna, it's all you.
Well, I looked around the room and there's not a whole lot of guys here because they really need to pay attention, so I guess three guys.
You need to speak up a little.
Speak up, speak up.
Speak up.
You've got too much competition.
Yeah.
November the 6th, my husband and me celebrated our 57th anniversary. So, the words that I'm going to be reading are words that I have used in my marriage, and you will, you women will understand. You men may not. But anyway. 9 words that women use, and men really need to understand these words. The first word is fine. How many ladies can do it? Fine. This is a word that women use to end an argument where they're right and you need to shut up. Fine. 5 minutes. Now she's getting dressed. That means a half an hour. 5 minutes is only really 5 minutes if you've just been given 5 more minutes to finish watching the game before you're supposed to be helping with the housework. Next word is very important. Nothing. What is wrong, honey? Nothing. This is the calm before the storm. The word nothing means something, and you should be on your toes. Arguments that begin with nothing always end with fine. Go ahead. This is a dare, not a permission. Do not do it. Loud sigh. This is actually a word, but it's a nonverbal statement that is very often misunderstood by men. A loud sigh means that she thinks you're an idiot and wonders why she's wasting her time standing here arguing with you about nothing, for the meaning of nothing referred back to number 3. Number 6, that's okay. This is one of the most dangerous statements that a woman can make to a man. That's okay. Means that she wants you to think long and hard before deciding how you're going to pay for your mistake. Thanks. A woman is thanking you, don't question it, don't faint, just say you're welcome. I do want to add here a clause though, unless she says thanks a lot, that is sure sarcasm, and she's not thanking you at all. Do not say you're welcome, because if you do, that will bring on the whatever, and the whatever is a woman's way of saying whatever happens, I'm not going to be happy. The last one. Don't worry about it. I got it. Just don't worry about it. I've got it. Another dangerous statement, meaning that there is something that a woman has told a man to do now several times, but is now doing herself because he never did it. This will later result in a man asking, honey, what's wrong? But the woman's response referred to number 3, which is nothing. There's more men up there that have this out.
Just on time.
All right. 2 elderly women were driving on a large car. Both could barely see over the dashboard. As they were cruising along, they came to an intersection. The stoplight was red, but they just went on through. The woman in the passenger seat thought to herself, I must be losing it. I could have swore we just went for a red light. After a few more minutes, they came to another intersection, and the light was red again. Again, they went right through. The woman in the passenger seat was almost sure that the light had been red, but was really concerned that she was losing it. She was getting nervous. At the next intersection, sure enough, the light was red and they went through. So she turned to the other woman and said, "Mildred, do you know that we just ran through 3 red lights in a row? You could have killed us both." Mildred turned and says, "Oh my gosh, am I driving?"
Oh, thank you.
This is sometimes that does happen too, but anyway. All right. This is called clay balls. A man was exploring caves by the seashore. In one of the caves, he found a canvas bag with a bunch of hardened clay balls. It was like someone had rolled clay balls and left them out in the sun to bake. They didn't look like much, but they encouraged him, this man, so he took the bag out of the cave with him. As he strolled along the beach, he could throw the clay balls one at a time out into the ocean as far as he could. He thought little about it until he dropped one of the clay balls and it cracked open on the rock. Inside was a beautiful, precious stone. Excited, the man started breaking open the remaining clay balls, each containing a similar treasure. He found thousands of dollars worth of jewels in the 20 or so clay balls he had left. Then it struck him. He had been on the beach for a long time. He had thrown maybe 50 to 60 of the clay balls with their hidden treasures into the ocean waves. Instead of dollars in treasure, he could have taken home tens of thousands, but he just threw them away. It's like that with people. We look at someone, maybe even ourselves, and we see an external clay vessel. It doesn't look like much from the outside. It is always beautiful or sparkling, it isn't always beautiful or sparkling, so we discount it. We see that person as less important than someone more beautiful or stylish or well-known or wealthy, but we have not taken the time to find the treasure hidden inside that person. There is a treasure in each one of us. We take the time to get to know that person. If we ask God to show us that person the way he sees them, then the clay begins to peel away and the brilliant gem begins to shine forth. May you not come to the end of our lives and find out that we have thrown away a fortune and friendship because the gems were hidden in bits of clay. May we see people in the world as God sees them.
Oh, thank you.
Well, I'm glad we ended on that positive note. I have to say I was a little traumatized with those words being recounted. All of us guys start to get triggered when we hear some of those words. But I do feel like that was a little bit of a, like, I guess when people play video games, they look for the cheat codes to get to the end of each of the levels. That's the cheat code. Like, that's the cheat sheet for marriage for some of us younger guys to kind of figure out how to interpret certain things that our spouses can say at times. So I might get that from you so I can pass it on in premarital counseling sessions and things like that. You know? Might help. Yeah, we can still learn from it even years later. But yeah, congrats on that anniversary. How many years did you say? 50?
57.
57 years. That's awesome.
I met
You guys must have got married when you were 12.
I was 17, but I met him when I was 13, but he didn't like me.
Oh, really? Took him
Years later.
5 years or so, or 4 years to
To
get
decide
that.
that he did like me after all.
Couldn't get away from you or something. I don't know. So
Well,
pretty
there's
remarkable.
a story behind that, but I don't think I should probably tell it.
That's all right. That's all right.
It's a quick story.
Yeah.
My dad was,
Hey y'all, here's how Donna got married at 17. This is the true life story of Donna Watts.
well, my dad was an alcoholic, so I didn't do a whole lot of dating or had a whole lot of friends because he really was a real drunk. And my husband told his friends, he made a bet that he was going to date old man Rick's daughter.
Oh.
Now, whether he was a good bet or a bad bet, but we've been together for 57 years on that
Wow.
one bet.
Wow. It's amazing how much of your life can turn on a dime.
Yes.
Or a bet, I guess it would be.
It's a bet. Well, I'm not sure he won the bet or he didn't win the bet.
Well, he's definitely earned whatever he got from the bet, I guess, if you will. 57 years. That's pretty awesome. As generations are going, you can tell younger generations aren't as familiar with long-term relationships and such. I would imagine in this room, with the number of years added up, for some of you who've been married to your spouses, maybe some of them have passed and such, but for a number of years have lots of stories from your relationship, and the good times and the bad times. It'd be kind of interesting for us to have a time to talk and share about some of that on one occasion or another. But this is a good group of folks that I think building relationships with one another is what we're about, why we're here. And so these lessons are a way to kind of give us an excuse to get together, but the biggest, I think, most important thing that's happening here is just how we're learning about each other's lives, and I think we gain a lot from that. So speaking about learning from life, this study that we're getting into, this is the first week, so Andy, you picked a good week to join us, that we're going to be studying through the life of David. Who knows, who knows how, you know that name. Who knows how long we'll be in this with the way I ramble, but we do want to take some time studying his life, because it's a remarkable life, full of ups and downs, but in the midst of that, we get to see God's sovereignty, His goodness in the life of a man who was not perfect, but he had integrity. And so I think there's a lot we can learn from it. It's funny, Connie was joking right when we got, I'm telling on you now, right when we got together this morning, she's like, the Old Testament, I don't understand it. People are just lopping off each other's heads and things like that. What's going on there? So that's kind of the way it feels sometimes when you're just reading straight through books like this. But what we're doing here with David's life is almost, we're approaching his life like it's a biography. So the book that many of you have already kind of taken on and started to read will actually mirror the lessons that I'll be talking about in class today, is written by Charles Swindoll as a biography, taking the text from the Old Testament to describe David's life. So seeing it from that perspective, I think, may shine new light on maybe a person or a character that you've been familiar with for a long time. So this is what we're going to jump into today, and really today's going to be about where David's come from, what his background is, and that's going to help us as we get into some of the things that we're going to study, the events that happened in his life. So everybody has a handout, hopefully, with some blanks. Got to keep you guys on your toes, making sure you get these blanks filled in. We may or may not have tests. We'll see how it goes. But that seemed to be a fun little diversion, at least for us. So maybe I can throw some of those together along the way. So make sure you're paying close attention. If you miss a blank, it's okay to cheat in this class. You can look over to your neighbor and pull some answers. It's not like you've asked for my permission or waited for my permission in the past when it comes to that. So let's jump into it. Samuel described David at a young age with these words, that he was ruddy, R-U-D-D-Y, ruddy. That's a good description for a guy. Ruddy, with beautiful eyes and a handsome appearance. Okay? So, he had a lot going for him when it comes to the looks.
He did.
We're not really sure. I mean, this is really the only physical description that we have of David. You don't know what color his hair was. Maybe he was a redhead. We don't know for sure. Probably tan from shepherding and things like that. So it's just interesting, though, of people in the Bible that we really have physical descriptions. David is a rare one that you have some of that described for him. But the point of this is that his outward appearance didn't necessarily set him apart in any way. This is important for us to notice this, because we're going to see another person's appearance described who's kind of the antagonist, where David is the protagonist, he's the antagonist of David's life. That's Saul. So this kind of plays into what we learn about the dynamic between David and Saul. The fact that David was attractive, but wasn't like, he didn't stand out in the crowd as far as his physical appearance was. So if we were neighboring farmers, we probably wouldn't have even known who David was, because he was part of a big family and was not necessarily the most, it didn't stand out amongst the others in his family as well. His father, in fact, almost forgot about him when his father was introducing his sons to the prophet Samuel. So Samuel goes to, we don't have time to go into all the details of the story, but we'll see a little bit of it today. But Samuel goes to David's house, and God has basically led him to this place to find who the next king will be. And so he's going there to figure out who's going to be the next one to be anointed. Samuel, the way it was in the Old Testament, when, at least for the kings of Israel, you would have a prophet who would anoint that king, and that shows God's favor on that particular person. So Samuel was trying to do this, and you have David's father introducing all of David's older brothers before he ever even gets to David, and even forgets that David's out in the field at the same time. So David was nothing more than a very young shepherd living in a small town, but it was God who had a remarkable plan for him to become the king of Israel. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how all that happens today, and then actually it'll be a few weeks that we'll be talking through this, because the journey of David becoming the king of Israel is a long journey. And it's a very, pretty captivating journey, lots of twists and turns for it. So, before we get to that though, we need to step back about 40 years, that's a blank, 40 years, to get a sense of the background and the history that David was actually born in. So we'll have an idea of who he was and what made him God's choice to be king. So, David's time frame, the period in which he was born as an Israelite was actually in the middle of a long drift from paying attention to God. So the Israelites had spent a long period of time being distracted by lots of things, but their neighbors, essentially, the Philistines, Canaanites, all these folks that are surrounding them, was pulling their attention away from God, and they've been basically paying less and less attention to the things of God, God's law, over this period of history. And so you have these problems that are taking place, not just among the common people, the Israelites, but also within the priesthood. And so you have Eli, who was a priest, that was a blank, and his wicked sons were actually gone from the priesthood. God had driven Eli and his sons out. Eli favored his sons over the Israelites, and his sons were basically just in the whole power thing for themselves and taking advantage of the Israelites as priests. And so Samuel would step in as the last of the judges, okay? So Eli and his wicked sons are gone. Samuel comes in, and he's one of the last of the judges. And he's now getting older. So the glory days of Samuel and Israel basically have passed. They are now in the last part of the time of the judges, and things are not going well for Israel. Now Samuel tried to appoint his sons to become judges of Israel, but that became obvious that it was a big mistake. So mistake is another blank there. You can see that in 1 Samuel chapter 8. I'll just read through a little bit of that here. So 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 1 through 3. When Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as judges for Israel. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second was Abijah. And they served at Beersheba, but his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain and accepted bribes and perverted justice. So very similar to Eli's sons, these Samuel's sons are not respecting their father and not respecting the role that they would have served as judges. So verse 4 says, all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. And they said to him, you are old and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have. That's a key thing there. We'll talk about that. So the people were disillusioned with judges, and they wanted a king. Okay, so in Israel's history, you had the time of the patriarchs. The patriarchs are the people like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then you had Jacob's sons, who then became the tribes of Israel. And so that was a time of patriarchy where you had one person who was a representative of God for all the people, right? So you have Moses and Abraham and those people. After that time period passed, then you enter into a time when the kingdoms when there was conflict between the tribes, and there was a split in the kingdom. Then you had these judges that would come along, that were supposed to be God's prophets as well as basically political leaders for the Israelites. And so the period of the judges lasted to this point with Samuel. And now, as the period of the judges come to an end, because it's not working anymore, these people who were being appointed as judges are just as corrupt as any other political leader. Now they want a king, and the reason that they want a king is important for us to notice. They spelled out 3 different reasons why they wanted a king. They said that Samuel was old, that their sons didn't walk in his ways, and that all the other nations had a king. Now remember, I said the Israelites were on this long journey separated from God, and part of the reason for that is they were paying too close attention to how life was lived by everybody else, by the Canaanites and the Philistines and Amorites and all these folks who had surrounded them. And all of these other groups of people had kings. Now it is the tendency of humans, true for all of us, to want to be like others, like to be like everyone else. That's a blank. It is our tendency to want to fit in. When we try to stand out, that could put us in a place of danger, or can cause people to lash out if we stand out in a crowd. And so we are, as humans, we are prone to desire to fit into groups. Well, that desire, that tendency that we have is evident here with the Israelites in how they paid attention to how everyone else around them did life. The gods that they worshiped, and also how they set up their government. They wanted a king like everybody else. So they would gripe to Samuel. Part of the problem there was that Samuel was calling them to worship this invisible God. Well, this is very different from everybody else as well, right? What did other people worship? Idols, right? So they had these physical manifestations or objects that they could fixate their worship on, and it's easier for us to be able to worship something that's solid than an invisible God. So you have this pattern happening all through Israel's history, and actually all through human history. But obvious examples of this are when Moses has gone up into the mountain and there's the thunder and the clouds and all that, but you don't really see much going on up there. Moses was up there way too long. So what did they do? The Israelites, when he was up there. Yeah, they actually took their jewelry, melted it all together. I can imagine some of the husbands talking to their wives and the wives saying, "Fine. Take my earring."
Whatever.
That's right. Cheat code. So they melted their jewelry all together. They built this golden calf, and we look at that and we're like, this is the weirdest thing ever. Why would you want to do something like that? And you had perfectly good earrings, and now you have this strange looking cow that everybody's bowing to and such. But all this goes back to our desire to want to have something in front of us that we can fixate our worship on, worship of idols. Well, that's related to their desire to have a king, because a king is a physical representation of their power, right? Judges are kind of like these brainiacs who basically know the law and they interpret the law and things like that, but we want a king. We want a ruler who obviously is a king, right? Because he's a representation of the power of the kingdom. Very British, right? So they wanted to be like the Philistines and the Moabites and the Jebusites and all the nations that had the kings that surrounded them. So that's part of the reasoning why they were asking Samuel to appoint a king. So this is why Samuel's doing what he's about to do. And it continues in 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 6 through 8. But when they said, "Give us a king to lead us," this displeased Samuel, so he prayed to the Lord, and the Lord told him, "Listen to all that the people are saying to you. It's not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king. As they have done from this day, as they have done from this day, I brought them out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are doing to you." See, God himself is making the connection here before Samuel, saying these people love worshiping stuff that they can see. And they can't see me as their king. They couldn't see me as their king back in the time of Moses out of Egypt, and the same thing is still true today. So listen to them. but warn them solemnly and let them know what the king who will reign over them will do. Okay, so here's the ominous warning from God. This kind of thing still happens today, even in church. Okay, we have a tendency as Christians to put leaders in the place of God as a ruler. Okay, whether that be a preacher or a politician or any other type of dynamic person that we tend to agree with, tend to follow, tend to like, we can sometimes give them a little bit more credit or assume that they have a little bit more control over circumstances than who our true king is and what power he has. And so that's something that is just a part of what it means to be humans worshiping God. And God is calling this out, and he's saying, okay, allow this to happen, but here's going to be some of the results. And he gives Samuel a little bit of a heads up of what that's going to look like. So God ends up giving them exactly what they wanted. And of course, the man that they're going to choose, since the reasoning for their having a king was they wanted to be a visible representation of power and authority from God, they're going to try and find someone who's tall, dark, and handsome. And so they found that man in Saul. He is the GQ image for Israel to show off to their neighbors. He's going to be the best looking king in the king pageants that there ever was, right? So,
Were you there?
What's that?
Were you there?
Was I there? No. No. And I've seen, some people in. I mean, we still do this in Hollywood, right? We're always like we want our stars, right? And the same thing is true even in the Protestant church. There are celebrity preachers, and those preachers are so dynamic and so good looking, some of them, and they have these huge congregations. And those people ain't there to worship God. They're there to worship the cult of personality, right? Now, I'm not throwing any names out there or anything like that, and I don't say people do this intentionally, but it is very easy for us to slide into these same things. So Saul is that guy. He sweeps everyone off their feet with a measure of humility, right? He comes in and he's like, I don't know if I can be king, I don't know if I can handle all this, and he's got that humility to begin with, but he knew how to rally people around a cause. And so, even though, here's a blank, Saul was 40 years old when he started to rule, before long he became very different in power than the man he was before he took this position of power. Power corrupts, doesn't it? Oftentimes. This is what happens for Saul. He becomes thin-skinned, hot-tempered. He's given to seasons of depression. So the people's choice changes because what we see, what we think we see in people is oftentimes very different from what God knows of people. God sees to the inside, sees the heart. You'll see this kind of phrasing used as David is chosen by God. So now you have Saul, who's already chosen by the people's choice. A tall, dark, and handsome king who will represent Israel well. And the very beginning of his rule, he is doing a great job. Everybody loves him. He's a humble king. But then things start shifting fairly quickly for Saul. So then David was born 10 years after Saul actually became king. So you see the age difference here. And David was born into a people that were far from God and disillusioned by their king. So by the time that David comes around and he comes of age, the Israelites already had seen enough, had enough of Saul as their king. There was real turmoil taking place there that David was a part of, was able to witness. And so this is where God intervenes through the prophet Samuel once again. Okay? So when we get into David in his younger years and Goliath and the Philistines and all that, you'll see the connection there between the problems that Israel had with Saul and also how David was going to be God's solution to this dilemma, this issue. Okay? So this is Saul, the people's choice, and how he became king. Now we're going to look at how David is anointed king as the Lord's choice. And so over in 1 Samuel chapter 13, you see Samuel follows through with the directive that he has from the people to pick a king, and God says, go ahead and go through with that. And so then, let's see, Samuel, there's also some other stuff that goes along with this in between Saul, the people asking for a king, and then God taking the kingdom away from Saul. So along with the people's issue with Saul, God actually had an issue with Saul as well, because Saul stopped following God's directives and his commands. One of the big things that God told Saul to do was whenever you were to conquer a land and a people, you're supposed to destroy everything, not take anything with you out of this land that you've conquered. Why do you think God would say that to Saul? Don't take anything from these foreign lands that you're conquering.
Because people being attacked.
Yes, right. So like if you go and in this situation, these wars that were fought in the Old Testament, it wasn't just over property or land. It was actually over the way people were living. And God, in His sovereignty, was trying to rid the world of sin through battles with the Israelites. Okay, so some of these pagan kingdoms, God was actually sending Israelites in that kingdom so that that false worship of pagan gods would stop. Well, that would totally short-circuit the whole process if you win a battle and then you take these foreign gods from these people and start worshiping them yourself. And that's the kind of thing that was happening with Saul. And so God confronts Saul through Samuel and basically says, I'm going to take the kingdom from you and give it to someone else because you would not follow through with what I commanded you to do. So then, that's what Samuel's doing. He's rebuking Saul in chapter 13, and then in verses 13 and 14, this is what he says. He says, you acted foolishly. You've not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, He would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after His own heart and appointed him leader of His own people because you've not kept the Lord's command. So it's not just that God thought that David was a better choice. It was also Saul gave up his authority and gave up his ability to rule because he would not obey what God had asked him to do. And so David was just a man, but God turned him into a remarkable man over time. And we're going to see that progression. Okay, so you have the description there in verse 14 that you've often heard referred to David, right? A man after God's own heart. So that was the core, that was the diamond in the rough, if you will, of David. He had something within him that's different from what was in Saul, that is more connected to God's heart. And we're going to be able to see how God takes that diamond in the rough and makes him into the king that he becomes. So just like with a diamond, it takes a whole lot of pressure over a period of time. That's exactly what's going to happen in David's life. A lot of pressure over a period of time for him to rise above and become a person that God needed him to be in order to rule over Israel in the way that he did. So, what's remarkable about David is that there's been more written about him than any other character in the Bible, including Jesus. Well, unless you take the prophecies. Like if you get into the prophecies, then you'll see there's a lot more written about Jesus. But when you look at any of the Old Testament characters, you can see the comparison there. Abraham, you've got 14 chapters. Joseph, 14. Jacob, 11. Elijah, 10 chapters. David had 66 chapters. 66 chapters written about his life in the Old Testament. Yeah, it makes it easy to remember. There's 66 books in the Bible, 66 chapters about David. Maybe that would be a good quiz question. So, here's the thing about this. When we are beginning talking about David and what's good about him, it's easy for us to then say, okay, let's put him on this pedestal, make him a superhero in our mind. Because God has already said, here's a man after my own heart. You see all of this that's written about him. But I want us to try and keep in mind how flawed and human David actually was, especially early on, and even in the latter part of his life as well. So we need to really set the record straight on the kind of people that God chooses and uses, because if we don't do this, if we don't keep ourselves honest about who David actually was and how God used him despite his flaws, then we will sometimes second guess our ability to be used by God. And that's not what I want to happen as a result of our study of David's life. So we're going to look through Scripture, through a lot of these chapters that were written about him in the Old Testament, and we're going to be reminded also of how God takes people who are flawed and works with them in such a way to do more with them than they could do for themselves. 1 Corinthians 1 is a great example of that. The context of that chapter, the chapter itself is just a good description of how God uses people. But the context has to do with the way different people viewed Paul. You've heard that guy before. We just saw his biography, if you will, in the book of Acts. Even though, as a result of our studying through Paul's life, we can see how remarkable he was. Not everybody agreed that Paul was a great guy. Even people in churches in that time. He was controversial, especially in the Corinthian church. That church was divided over who was the best leader for them to follow. And Paul addresses this directly in 1 Corinthians, and so that's the context there. And the Jews wanted Paul to prove that he was from God through miracles, right? They wanted Paul to demonstrate his authority from God in the same way that they saw it happen in the book of Acts. They wanted that to continue through these miracles. The Greeks wanted Paul to have brains and brawn or beauty. That was the kind of leader that the Greek Christians were looking for. The inner man was not as important to them. So Paul responds to all of this in 1 Corinthians by saying that he only comes in the power of God, and this is for a good reason. So that's where we see in 1 Corinthians, I'll read chapter 1, verses 26 through 29. Paul talking about his own ministry and the power of his ministry. Verses 26, he says, "Brothers, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. He chose the lowly things of this world and the despised things and the things that are not to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before him." So that's the main reason. No one boasting before God. So when we think about a guy like David, we tend to be, oftentimes it's our culture is very much like the Greek culture in that time, where we're looking for the beautiful and the brilliant and the successful people to be the ones who lead. You can see this kind of thing if you think about, who qualifies to be the president in the United States. You're not going to, for example, if someone has cerebral palsy, there's nothing wrong with their mind. There's something wrong with the nerve connections between their mind and their body. What are the chances, you think, someone having cerebral palsy could ever be elected president in our country? Probably pretty slim, right? Because we still look for an image of power, don't we? If you remember Roosevelt, what did Roosevelt have? Polio. He had polio. And he was known as one of the manliest of the presidents, right? He loved to box and all of these things, and he kept that image about himself, even in the midst of struggling with polio, to the point that he was bound to a wheelchair for a period of time. But whenever he was before people, that wheelchair was nowhere to be found. And this is kind of a generational thing in that time as well, but it's very much still true today. When we are looking at a leader, there's a certain type of demographic or image that we look for because of that outside way of looking at people. And so David's life is a great example of someone who you get past the outside and see within that there's more that makes a leader than just the image itself. And so God takes this nobody and turns him into a somebody. It's a pretty remarkable story. So, from all of this, it's crazy how quick time will go as we go through these lessons. Here are 3 priorities for God-appointed servant leaders. So what was true then would still be true today. When God looks for leaders, he's looking for normal people like you and I, but he's also looking for certain qualities in people that David demonstrated in his life. The first one is spirituality. To be a person after God's own heart. Well, what does that mean? Any guess on that? To be a person after God's heart. How would you describe that? What does that mean?
be as, like if you look at a son and his father, and you say, oh, he takes after his father because he looks like him. You know what I'm saying? I'm not saying physically, but I mean looking like God spiritually.
Yes.
Like he's trying to be all he can be for God because he is, in God's family. I always just think of it's like, he takes after his father.
Yeah, and that's not necessarily a tangible thing. It's more intangible than tangible. is what
That's
you're
why I
saying.
couldn't word it.
It's like wanting to do his will at all
Yes.
times.
Yeah. So Donna was saying, just wanting to do God's will, having the same desires that God has. I think that's kind of the nutshell, and this is what I have written here, is that what's important to God is important to you. Now, David didn't demonstrate that all the time, right? But there's aspects to David's life or his way of seeing life and the world around him that was connected to the way God has created things and sees things. So God looks for hearts with no locked closets, right? God looks for integrity, admitting when you're wrong. Those are the things that that David demonstrated. He was not perfect, but when he messed up, he did admit and he had integrity towards that. So spirituality is part of that. Being a person after God's own heart, we still want that for our leaders today. Secondly, humility. Humility. So you'll see this with David's life. 1 Samuel 16. When David had gone a short distance, hold on a second. I'm in 2 Samuel. This doesn't make sense. The Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king of Israel? Fill your horn with oil, be on your way. I'm sending you to Jesse at Bethlehem. I've chosen one of his sons to be king." I'm not sure why I picked that particular verse as an example of it, but it was God who had chosen him to be king. And David, throughout the time that he was being anointed, and you'll see even in the time after he was anointed, he demonstrated humility. God had already visited Jesse's house. That's David's dad, Jesse, to scope out David, right? In spiritual form. God was already aware of David being in Jesse's house, and he was going to be the one who was king. So God had already seen into David's heart and saw that he was completely the kind of heart, the servant heart, that he was looking for. Now, what was David doing at the time Samuel found him? Shepherding sheep. So that's probably a source of some of that humility. Psalm 78, 70, we won't have time to look at those verses, but those are written by David, and they are a picture of his humility. So God doesn't care about image, that's a blank. He finds character and then gives the necessary image as is needed for the circumstance. Right? So God doesn't care about image, he finds character, and then the image follows. Whereas with people looking for a leader, they start with image oftentimes, and then character tends to follow. But a servant leader doesn't care who gets the glory. The goal is to make the person that they serve look better, or make the situation that they're leading become better over their image. So humility, spirituality, and then thirdly, integrity. Integrity. So then Psalm 78. Verses 71, 72. From the tending the sheep he brought him, this is speaking of David, to be the shepherd of his people Jacob, of Israel his inheritance. And David shepherded them with integrity of heart, with skillful hands he led them. In a world where a good impression is all that matters, God looks for wholeness. Wholeness. He's not impressed with externals. Wholeness. That means spiritually, emotionally, in all ways, you have integrity towards God. So then, once he finds the raw material, the leader in David, then he will be training him for leadership. And so you're going to see these themes happening with David's life in the early years of him being groomed for leadership over Israel. So after God made his choice, he began to train David for his leadership role through 4 disciplines. First, solitude. Most of life's major lessons are learned alone during periods of reflection. You even see this in Jesus' life. He's got 30 years of living under the radar until the 3 years of notoriety. Now, angels announced his birth. There were kings from distant lands and shepherds looking for this baby. And now, and he made a huge impression on the teachers in the temple at the age of 12. But yet, even after all of that, he lives under the radar until the time arrives where he launches into his ministry at the baptism with John. So solitude is part of that. If you can't stand to be alone with yourself, you have deep unresolved conflict in your inner life. So turn your car radio off every once in a while and sit with yourself. It's important to do that every once in a while in this noisy land we live in. You didn't see that lesson coming from the right. I threw a curve at you. So David first learned to be king, to king it, if you will, in nature with a bunch of dumb sheep. Right? That's the solitude for him. Secondly, obscurity. Most of God's workers are first unknown and unappreciated in the formative times in their life. Obscurity. Once again, Jesus is a good example of this. Obscurity. obscurity. Those who first accept the silence of obscurity are the best qualified to handle the applause of popularity. It's a quote right out of Swindoll's book. Qualified to handle the applause of popularity. This is what happens when you have these child stars that get all this popularity before they're ready to handle it, and then they go off the deep end. This is an example of why that's important. You need some time in obscurity. Third, monotony. M-O-N-O-T-O-N-Y. Monotony. Being faithful in the menial, uneventful, routine, daily tasks of life. Because it's in those places where no one else notices or even cares how well you're doing that you learn to be faithful. And you develop the qualities of leadership. A lot of people who we recognize now as great leaders were great leaders for only a few years of time. 3, 5, 6 years. And all of their life preceding those years, those few years, were these things, these disciplines taking place. And then they shine in such a way that we look at their life and we think, well, they lived their whole life in this type of fame and power, but that's not exactly what happens for most people. All right, so you've got solitude, obscurity, monotony, and then number 4, reality. Reality. So David was busy with hard knocks, defending himself against Saul's prejudices against a young shepherd boy. And it's pretty remarkable how Saul and David's life intersect even before David becomes king. And all of this has to do with God's providence. But you have in 1 Samuel chapter 17 the story of how David defeats Goliath, and then verses 34 and 35. It says, David said to Saul, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair. We're talking about a bear now. I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Okay, so before David ever defeated Goliath, he was fighting bears off of sheep. Okay? School of hard knocks. So David's courage was formed well before Goliath came around. That's a blank, Goliath. So David was well aware of that kind of a battle where he is the underdog even before Goliath, and God was using these opportunities in these quiet places that no one else was watching to form David into the kind of young man that he demonstrated himself to be there before Goliath, this king. This warrior. And he's explaining all this to Saul, because Saul didn't want him to go out there. He thought, this dude's not going to make it. He can't even fit in my armor. And so he's trying to say, look, I've grabbed bears by the hair before. So God will never fix a flat tire for us. Let me know if God has ever fixed a flat tire for you. God never killed a bear for David. But what God does is he uses these moments to teach us how to overcome, how to lead, how to make good decisions, the right decisions, things like that. So here's a couple of things to take away from our time together today. It's in the little things and in the lonely places that we prove ourselves capable of big things. Little things and lonely places. And when God develops our inner quality, He is never in a hurry. We never know what God has planned for us, and it doesn't matter what part of life we're in. You could be spending 50, 60 years of your life in relative obscurity and in the hard lessons of life, and then all of a sudden, one day, your life can change very quickly if God chooses to put you in a position where He's going to use you in a dramatic way or in a visible way. But regardless of whether that visibility or leadership or any of those types of things ever take place, what the point of all of this is faithfulness, day in and day out, integrity, whether or not someone's watching. These are the kinds of things that cause you to be a person after God's own heart. And that's what we want to strive to do and to be. All right? So thanks for your time this morning. Before we are done today, here's some things that I want you to be aware of, to be praying for, and we'll go ahead and cut the stream to YouTube. Thanks for joining us, YouTube land. We'll see you whenever you play this video again. So here's some stuff going on with folks that I want to make sure you're aware of.